My name is Nora Whitfield, and I'm 56 years old. She stole the one thing I swore I'd never share, my grandmother's secret recipe. Then she smiled in my face, opened her own bakery across town, and fed my life's work to the world as if it were hers. People cheered for her, while I watched everything I built fall apart. But I didn't scream, and I didn't beg. I just waited. For as long as I can remember, my life has revolved around the comforting hum of ovens, the soft patter of flour against wooden counters, and the smell of melted butter swirling with vanilla. Baking wasn't just something I did, it was who I was. When I was little, I would stand on a stool beside my grandmother, watching her stir pots and fold dough with the kind of patience only a woman who'd lived through both love and loss could possess. She taught me that baking wasn't about ingredients alone, it was about heart. People can taste sincerity, she used to say, tapping my nose with a dusting of sugar. Never serve anything you don't believe in. Her most cherished creation was her butterscotch apple crumble pie, a dessert that seemed to hold magic in every bite. When she passed, she left me her recipe written in her delicate cursive on a yellowing card. That piece of paper became my most prized possession, something I guarded more carefully than money. Years later, when I finally opened my own bakery, the Golden Whisk, in our quiet New Hampshire town, that pie became the star of the menu. People came from nearby cities to taste it. They said it reminded them of home, of Sunday afternoons, of comfort they didn't know they missed. I loved seeing their faces light up after the first bite. It made the long mornings worth it. Running the Golden Whisk wasn't easy. I woke before dawn, kneaded dough until my wrists ached, and often closed shop long after dark. But I never complained, because I wasn't alone. My best friend, Melinda Carter, had been with me through it all. We met in college, two dreamers who bonded over cheap coffee and wild ideas of someday doing something that mattered. She was there when I bought the bakery, when I doubted myself, when my marriage fell apart. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who brought over soup when you were sick, who laughed loudly enough to fill a room. I used to tell everyone that she was my chosen sister, and I meant it. For 25 years, Melinda stood behind my counter, managing orders, greeting customers, and handling paperwork when I was too tired to think straight. I trusted her completely. She knew every recipe, every secret, every trick I'd inherited from generations of bakers. She had access to everything, including my old recipe cards. I never once questioned it. Why would I? She was family to me. We celebrated holidays together, shared tears, gossip, and wine. When business slowed, she stayed late without being asked. When business boomed, she said she was proud of me. Or at least, that's what I thought. Looking back now, I can see the signs I ignored. The way she sometimes lingered too long near my recipe drawer, the questions she'd ask about the spice ratios, or how often she mentioned branching out someday. I brushed it off as curiosity or ambition. I had no reason to think the woman I called my best friend could ever betray me, until the night she did. It was late, I'd been in the back room finishing inventory. The lights in the front were dim, and I remember hearing faint shuffling. When I stepped out, I saw Melinda standing at the counter. My recipe box open beside her. She was holding her phone above one of the cards, the butterscotch apple crumble recipe, snapping pictures. For a second, my brain didn't register what I was seeing. Then my chest tightened, and I asked, half joking, half nervous, "What are you doing?" She froze, then gave a small laugh, waving her phone dismissively. "Oh, Nora, I was just saving these for you," she said lightly. "You're terrible at keeping paper things organized. What if you lose them someday?" Something about the way she smiled didn't feel right. It wasn't her usual warm grin, it was smaller, tighter, practiced. But I wanted to believe her. After all, she'd been my friend for decades. So I told her to go home, that I'd see her tomorrow. And the next morning, she acted perfectly normal, chatting about the news, the weather, the new espresso supplier. I convinced myself I'd overreacted. Then she stopped coming to work. No call, no message. Just silence. A week passed. I called her house, no answer. I even stopped by once, but the blinds were closed. I told myself she must be sick, or traveling, or taking time for herself. Until one morning, while walking to the farmer's market, I saw a large banner being hoisted over the corner shop downtown, a place that had been vacant for months. The words on that big banner hit me like a punch. Coming soon, Crumble & Co. Bakery by Chef Melinda Carter. My stomach dropped. I remember standing there, frozen in the middle of the sidewalk, people brushing past me as if the world hadn't just tilted off its axis. I walked closer, reading the words again and again, hoping I'd misread them. But there was no mistake. Melinda, my Melinda, was opening a bakery. The same kind of bakery I had built from nothing. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick with disbelief. A few weeks later, her grand opening made the local paper. The article gushed about her innovative twist on traditional recipes and her family-inspired crumble pie. When I saw the photo attached, her holding a golden pie with caramelized apple slices and a crumble topping dusted with cinnamon sugar, I nearly dropped the newspaper. It was the same pie, my grandmother's pie. My handwriting still lived on that stolen recipe card, and now she was calling it hers. Curiosity, or maybe heartbreak, pulled me there that day. I stood across the street, watching through her bakery window as a crowd gathered. The air smelled like home butter, sugar, a touch of nostalgia. But it wasn't home anymore. It was theft disguised as charm. People clapped as Melinda cut the first slice, cameras flashing as she handed it out to eager customers. Reporters praised her original recipe as she smiled, her apron spotless, her hair tied neatly back like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. And me? I stood there, invisible among the crowd, my heart breaking quietly behind my crossed arms. Every cheer, every bite they took, every compliment they gave her felt like a piece of my soul being carved out and served on a plate. The woman I once called my sister was basking in a glory she'd stolen from me, from my grandmother, from every memory we'd built together. That day, I didn't go home right away. I just stood outside, staring through that glass window as the cameras flashed and she smiled for the local paper. She looked radiant, triumphant, like a woman who had never known guilt. And as she handed out samples of my pie to a crowd that adored her, I realized something inside me had changed. I didn't know it yet, but the recipe she stole wasn't just going to define her success, it was going to define her downfall. The morning after Melinda's grand opening, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping gently against my kitchen window. It should have been a comforting sound, the kind that usually put my mind at ease before a long day of baking. But that day, it just reminded me of her. The local paper had been delivered early, and there it was, lying on my doorstep, her smiling face splashed across the front page under the headline, "New Chef Shakes Up Small-Town Baking Scene." I didn't even have to read the article. The photograph said everything. Melinda stood in front of her brand new bakery, holding a golden pie like a trophy, surrounded by people I recognized, customers who once filled my tables. Her apron was spotless, her eyes bright, and that same fake, polished smile was plastered on her face. It felt like betrayal printed in ink. I told myself not to overthink it. I'd built the golden whisk from the ground up with honest hands and hard work. People would realize the truth eventually. Quality, sincerity, and soul would always outlast imitation. That's what I wanted to believe. So, I folded the paper, set it aside, and got dressed for work. I still had a bakery to run. That first week after her opening, I noticed little changes, things that seemed harmless at first. The morning rush wasn't as steady. The bell over the door didn't chime as often. My regulars, the ones who always ordered the same things, who shared stories about their families over coffee, began trickling away. One by one, they vanished. Some said they were trying the new place, just to see what the fuss was about. I didn't blame them. Curiosity is human nature. Still, the empty tables felt like open wounds. By the second week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. My assistant, Gretchen, came into the back room one afternoon, her face pale and tight. "Nora," she whispered, "you're not going to like this." She held out her phone, showing me a post from the town's community board. Someone had written, "You have to try Crumble & Co. Melinda's butterscotch apple crumble is divine. It tastes just like Nora's used to." The words blurred before my eyes. They meant it as a compliment, but every letter stung like a burn. They didn't know that it was mine. My recipe. My story. My legacy. I tried to keep the shop cheerful, to act like nothing was wrong. But the silence was deafening. The laughter, the hum of conversation, the clinking of coffee cups, all of it faded away. Some mornings, the only sound was the whir of the ceiling fan and the clock ticking above the register. Even the smell of fresh pastries, once comforting, began to feel hollow. I watched people stroll past my windows carrying Crumble & Co. pastry boxes the same cream color as mine used to be, tied with twine in the same rustic bow. She'd copied everything, down to the font on her chalkboard signs. And somehow, the town adored her for it. Gretchen tried to comfort me, but I could see the worry in her eyes too. "Maybe it's just a phase," she said, wiping down the counter. "New things always attract attention. People will come back." I wanted to believe her. But when I opened my ledger at the end of that week, the truth was printed in red ink. My profits had dropped by more than half. I couldn't afford fresh fruit for the pies anymore. I started buying frozen berries, cutting costs wherever I could. Every small compromise felt like a piece of my pride being chipped away. Then came the interviews. Melinda was everywhere, on the radio, in local blogs, in glossy features that praised her original recipes inspired by family tradition. Each time her name popped up, my stomach knotted. The woman who had stolen my life's work was now being celebrated for her innovation. There were even whispers that she'd been approached for a regional baking competition, the kind I'd always dreamed of entering. The bitterness inside me began to curdle into something heavier: shame. I felt foolish, naive for having trusted her so blindly. At night, I'd lie awake, the glow of the streetlight bleeding through my curtains, replaying every moment we'd shared. How many times had she looked me in the eye and lied? How long had she been planning this? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. She hadn't just taken my recipe. She'd taken my reputation, my livelihood, my place in this town. It didn't help that people had started talking. When I went to the grocery store or the post office, I could feel the curious glances. Some were sympathetic, but others were cautious, as if my failure might be contagious. Even my suppliers began hesitating, asking when I planned to rebrand or freshen things up. Their words were polite, but I could hear the doubt behind them. I tried to fight back in small ways. I introduced a few new desserts, tweaked the menu, ran a customer appreciation week, but nothing seemed to change. Each morning, I opened my doors to fewer and fewer people. I began baking smaller batches, then half batches, until one day, I realized I hadn't even turned on the second oven in over a week. The air felt heavy and stale without the usual bustle. The worst part was when I walked past Crumble & Co. on my way home. Through the wide front windows, I could see Melinda laughing with customers, her tables full, the walls glowing with warm light. Her bakery was lively, thriving exactly what mine used to be, and there I was, standing on the sidewalk, watching her live my dream as if she'd earned it. I would stare just long enough to feel the ache before forcing myself to move on. Then came the morning that nearly broke me. I arrived at the Golden Whisk early, determined to bake a new batch of scones and try to win back a few regulars. But before I even reached the door, I saw something taped to the glass. A thin white envelope fluttered in the wind. Inside was an eviction notice. I stood there on the sidewalk, reading the words over and over, my hands trembling. The landlord had decided not to renew my lease. The bakery I had poured my life into was being taken from me, not because of something I'd done wrong, but because someone else had decided they could do it better. When I locked the door that night, I didn't cry. I just stood there for a long time, looking at the faint reflection of myself in the window, surrounded by empty shelves and silent ovens. Everything I had built was slipping away, piece by piece. I told myself it couldn't get worse, that maybe I could start over somewhere else, smaller, quieter. But the universe wasn't done with its cruelty just yet. A week later, as I passed by my old building to collect the last of my things, I noticed something new: fresh paint, a new sign. And right there, mounted proudly above the door where my own sign had once hung, were the words that made my stomach twist. Crumble & Co. Melinda had taken over my space completely, my bakery, my corner, my home. I stood there, the late afternoon sun catching on the golden letters of her sign, and for the first time since it all began, the sadness inside me hardened into resolve. She had taken everything from me, but she hadn't seen the last of me. Packing up my bakery felt like lowering a coffin into the ground. Every whisk, every pan, every stained recipe card seemed to carry a heartbeat of its own. Echoes of laughter, the scent of cinnamon, and the sound of Gretchen's cheerful humming as she swept the floors each night. I stood in the middle of that empty space with boxes stacked around me, and for the first time in years, the air smelled cold, lifeless, and unfamiliar. The ovens were off, the walls were bare, and the warmth that had once filled the golden whisk was gone. I pressed my palm against the counter where I'd rolled out dough every morning, and my throat tightened. I had built this place from nothing but hope and hard work, and now it belonged to someone else. Or rather, it had been stolen from me. When I finally closed the door for the last time, I didn't look back. I couldn't. It felt too much like watching a loved one fade away. The jingling bell above the door gave one last hollow ring as it closed behind me, and that sound haunted me for weeks afterward. I loaded the last of my belongings into my car, a few utensils, a stack of old recipe books, and my grandmother's framed photograph, and drove home in silence. My little cottage had never felt lonelier. For a while, I couldn't even bear to step foot in my own kitchen. The sight of the oven made my chest ache. The smell of sugar or butter turned my stomach. I stopped baking entirely. I told myself it was just temporary, that I needed rest. But deep down, I knew I was avoiding the thing I loved most because it reminded me of what I'd lost. Days bled into nights, nights into weeks. I'd wake up late, barely eat, and stare out the window at the gray sky. Depression doesn't come crashing down like a wave, it seeps in slowly, like fog rolling through a valley, heavy and unrelenting. Friends called, some offered sympathy, others offered advice, but I withdrew further each time. I didn't want pity. I didn't want to explain that the pain wasn't just about losing a business, it was about losing trust, identity, and the legacy I had poured my life into. Sometimes I'd catch myself whispering questions to the silence. How could she do this? Was our friendship ever real? No answers came. The only voice that managed to pierce through the fog was my daughter Rachel's. She lived 2 states away, busy with her own life, but she called every few days just to check in. At first, I'd pretend everything was fine, masking my despair with small talk. But mothers and daughters share a bond that doesn't hide easily. One night, after she'd asked how I was holding up, I broke. I told her everything, the betrayal, the empty bakery, the eviction notice, all of it. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she said something that I'll never forget. "Mom," she said softly, "you don't let thieves define your story, you rewrite it." Those words lingered long after we hung up. They replayed in my head while I washed dishes, while I sat by the window at dusk, even as I tried to sleep. You rewrite it. For the first time in months, something inside me stirred faint but real. Maybe I had let Melinda take too much from me already. Maybe it was time to stop mourning and start rebuilding. The next morning, I found myself driving without much thought. My hands gripped the steering wheel as the familiar streets of downtown came into view. It had been months since I'd allowed myself to go there. When I turned the corner, the sight that greeted me felt like a cruel joke. Crumble & Co. was bustling, its windows fogged with warmth, laughter spilling out onto the street. People waited in line, chatting and smiling, oblivious to the truth of what they were consuming. There she was, Melinda, visible through the glass, moving gracefully behind the counter like she belonged there. I should have turned away, but I couldn't. I parked across the street and watched for a while, unseen behind the safety of my car window. My emotions twisted into a painful knot of anger and longing. Part of me wanted to hate her, to despise every ounce of her success, but another part, the stubborn part that had once called her my friend, wondered if she ever felt guilt, if she ever looked at those pies and thought of me. I was about to drive off when something caught my eye, a small, empty storefront right next door to Crumble & Co. It looked forgotten, the paint peeling from its frame, the windows clouded with dust. But the sight of that "For Lease" sign hanging crookedly in the window sent a jolt through me. It felt almost poetic, like fate itself had placed it there, daring me to act. My heart began to race. At first, I laughed at the thought. The idea of opening another bakery and right next to her seemed ridiculous. I was broke, exhausted, and barely had the will to bake again. But as I sat there staring at that dusty storefront, something inside me shifted. It wasn't bitterness anymore. It was determination. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe I couldn't let Melinda's betrayal be the final chapter in my story. The longer I looked at that building, the more the fear in me it began to fade. I imagined light pouring from those windows again, the smell of caramelized sugar and fresh bread filling the air. I could almost hear the laughter of customers, the sound of the register, the bell chiming as someone stepped inside. But most of all, I imagined her Melinda standing in her spotless shop next door, watching as my line grew longer than hers. The image was intoxicating. It wasn't about revenge for the sake of cruelty. It was about justice, about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. I got out of the car, rain starting to drizzle again, and walked up to the window of that vacant space. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, peering inside. The floors were scuffed, the walls cracked, but in that mess, I saw potential. I saw a beginning. My reflection stared back at me, tired, older, worn, but my eyes had something in them I hadn't seen in months. Fire. I took a deep breath and stepped back, staring at the for lease sign. My mind screamed that it was a terrible idea, that I couldn't afford another failure, but my heart whispered louder. Maybe life had taken everything from me so I could start fresh, stronger, smarter. Maybe this was my second chance not to erase the past, but to write over it. Before I could talk myself out of it, I pulled out my phone. My hands trembled as I dialed the number printed on the sign. Each ring felt like a countdown to either redemption or ruin. When the landlord's voice answered, my throat tightened, but I managed to speak. "Hi," I said, glancing one last time at Melinda's crowded cafe, then back to the dusty window in front of me. "I'm calling about the space next door to Crumble & Co." My heart pounded as I ended the call, the rain soaking through my coat. I didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, I knew I wasn't finished. When I signed the lease for the little shop beside Crumble & Co., my hands trembled around the pen. It wasn't fear. Not exactly, it was the realization that I was about to rebuild everything from the ashes of what Melinda had stolen. Every last dollar I had went into that deposit. The landlord's voice faded into the background as I stared at the blank interior through the dusty glass windows. It wasn't much cracked tile floors, flickering lights, peeling paint, but I saw beyond it. I saw warmth and color and hope. I saw justice rising from the scent of sugar and spice. This place would be my redemption, my statement, my silent battle cry. That night, I called Rachel. She was ecstatic when I told her. "You're doing it, Mom," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You're really doing it." We spent hours brainstorming names, tossing ideas back and forth until the words whisper and whisk slipped from her mouth like a melody. The moment I heard it, I felt something settle inside me. It was perfect, delicate, yet powerful. A whisper for my remated instabilidad, quiet resilience, and a whisk for the hands that would bring life back into my dreams. It wasn't just a bakery. It was a story. My story. From the start, I knew this new bakery couldn't just be a copy of what I'd lost. It had to be something more, something that represented everything Melinda wasn't. I decided my kitchen would be completely visible from the street. Large glass panels would replace the walls between the counter and the workspace, so that anyone passing by could watch the process, the kneading, the mixing, the measuring. No secrets, no deception. Every customer would see the truth baked right in front of their eyes. Transparency would be my declaration of honesty. The renovation process began with nothing but a vision and a few loyal hands. Gretchen didn't even hesitate when I asked her to join me again. She smiled through tears and said, "Let's show her what honesty tastes like." Her words became our mantra as we worked late nights, sanding old counters, painting walls, and repairing every inch of that forgotten space. There were times I wondered if I was out of my mind, rebuilding so close to the woman who destroyed me. But every hammer strike, every paint stroke felt like defiance, like reclaiming a part of myself I'd buried. I couldn't afford contractors, so I did most of it myself. Rachel helped from afar, sending decor ideas and funds when she could. I wanted the space to feel warm and open, soft cream walls, oak shelves lined with jars of sugar and flour, copper pans that glimmered in the light. The scent of caramelized butter and roasted pecans soon began to seep into the walls. It was exhausting work, but it gave me purpose again. My hands, once idle and trembling with sadness, found rhythm and strength in creation. And when it came to the recipes, I started from scratch. The butterscotch apple crumble pie had been my grandmother's gift, But now I wanted to honor her in a new way, not by reclaiming the past, but by evolving it. I spent nights experimenting, testing flavors until I could barely stand the sight of sugar. I filled notebooks with scribbles and ratios, chasing perfection not out of pride, but out of principle. Melinda had stolen my history. I would create a future she could never copy. My new signature dessert became the Honey Ember Tart, a blend of golden pears, toasted almonds, and spiced honey. It was bold, fragrant, and entirely mine. But even as I built this new beginning, a part of me still burned for justice. I didn't want to destroy Melinda outright. I wanted the truth to destroy her for me. People needed to see who she really was, and I had a plan. My grand opening would coincide with hers hosting a customer appreciation weekend. She'd planned it for months, I knew, because the local paper had announced it proudly. So I decided to open Whisper and Whisk the same weekend, right next door. It wasn't just coincidence, it was poetic symmetry. The weeks leading up to opening were a blur of motion and emotion. I designed the menu with precision, choosing names and flavors that carried meaning. Grace Scones, named after my grandmother. Second Chance Brioche, the reclaimed tart. Every item told a story, a quiet message to anyone who cared to listen. I also created small cards that went inside every box, each one printed with the same line. Authenticity can't be imitated. People whispered about the new bakery next to Crumble & Co. Some called it bold, others called it foolish. But curiosity was on my side. I didn't advertise much, I didn't need to. The mere fact that I had chosen that location spoke volumes. On the eve of the opening, Gretchen and I stayed late to finish the last details. The shelves gleamed, the ovens hummed softly, and the golden glow of the lights made the bakery feel alive. For the first time in years, I looked around and felt proud again. This wasn't revenge anymore, not entirely. It was redemption. It was proof that no matter how many times someone tried to break me, I would rise, stronger than before. We were sweeping the floors when the bell over the door chimed. I glanced up, expecting maybe the landlord or a curious neighbor, but when I saw who it was, my hand froze around the broom. Melinda stood in the doorway, her expression painted with feigned warmth. She wore one of her signature pastel dresses, her hair perfectly styled, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, look at this," she said lightly, stepping inside and glancing around as if she were inspecting the competition. "I just heard you were opening something new. Right next door, what are the odds?" Her tone was sweet, but the words were laced with poison. I steadied myself, forcing a polite smile. "Yes, life's full of surprises," I replied, my voice calm. She walked further in, running her fingers along the counter, pretending to admire it. "It's quaint," she said. "Very you." For a brief moment, our eyes met, and beneath her polished facade, I saw something flicker. Maybe it was annoyance. Maybe it was fear. Either way, it gave me strength. "I wish you the best of luck," she said finally, reaching for the door. "Though I can't imagine it'll be easy, opening so close to me." I tilted my head slightly. "That's the thing about baking, Melinda," I said quietly. "The right ingredients always speak for themselves." Her smile faltered just slightly before she turned and left. The bell jingled behind her, and the door shut with a sharp click. For a long moment, the bakery was silent except for the soft hum of the oven. Gretchen looked at me, eyes wide. "Well," she said slowly, "that was something." I exhaled, the tension draining from my shoulders. My heart was pounding, but not from fear, from anticipation. Tomorrow would be the day everything changed. Melinda thought she still had the upper hand, but she had no idea that the real battle hadn't even started yet. As I locked the door and glanced out the window, I caught sight of her walking back into her brightly lit shop, her shadow stretching across the pavement between us. I smiled faintly. The game was on. The night before my grand opening, sleep refused to come. I lay awake in bed, my mind running through every possible scenario, the crowd, the smells, the faces, and most of all, Melinda's reaction. For months, I'd dreamed of this moment, my chance to step out of the shadows she'd forced me into. Yet now that it was here, my stomach twisted with a mix of excitement and dread. I wanted it to be perfect, not just for me, but for every ounce of dignity she'd stripped away. Before dawn broke, I was already up, tying my apron, my hands trembling as I brewed the first pot of coffee. The sun rose slowly, painting streaks of gold across the window panes, and I whispered to myself, "This is it. Today we begin again." When I flipped the sign to open, I expected quiet, maybe one or two loyal faces. But to my surprise, a small crowd had gathered outside. Some people clutched their jackets against the morning chill, whispering to one another as they peeked through the glass. I could tell by their curious stares that not all of them were here for pastries. A few had come for the drama, drawn by gossip, the infamous bakery war that had been brewing in whispers for weeks. Still, I didn't care why they came, only that they did. Gretchen nudged me with a grin and said, "Well, looks like the town loves a good comeback." The first customer through the door was a familiar face, Mrs. Langley, a longtime patron who'd stopped visiting after Melinda opened. She hesitated for a moment, eyes darting around the space as if she wasn't sure she was welcome. Then she smiled timidly and said, "I couldn't resist seeing your new place, Nora." I greeted her warmly, offering a sample of the honey ember tart. Her eyes widened after the first bite, the kind of wide that needs no words. "It's wonderful," she murmured. "It tastes real." I laughed softly and replied, "It is." That word carried more weight than she could ever know. As the morning stretched on, the air filled with the scent of baked pears, cinnamon, and sugar. The smell drifted out the door, across the narrow alley, and into Melinda's cafe. I could see it happening, people walking out of her shop, lured by curiosity or nostalgia, glancing over at the line forming in front of mine. Within an hour, her crowd began to thin while mine grew. Some came in boldly, others sheepishly, as though stepping into enemy territory. A pair of young women whispered to each other, "We just want to compare," and ordered 2 slices of pie. When they tasted it, their chatter stopped. One of them looked up and said, "This tastes just like your old crumble." I smiled, setting down a cup of coffee. "No," I said gently. "This is the new one." Word spread fast. By noon, the bakery buzzed with chatter, laughter, and the sound of clinking mugs. The energy was alive, like old times, maybe even better. Gretchen moved gracefully behind the counter, keeping pace with the growing line, while I stayed at the oven, my rhythm steady and sure. Every golden crust, every swirl of frosting felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I had worried that working next door to Melinda would feel suffocating, but instead, it was invigorating. I could feel her presence across the wall, her desperation seeping through the air like stale perfume. At one point, I caught sight of her through the front window. She stood outside her bakery, pretending to sweep the sidewalk while sneaking glances toward my door. Her smile was tight, brittle, the kind you wear when you're pretending everything's fine. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. But then I remembered the nights I'd cried, the humiliation I'd endured, and pity evaporated like steam. By mid-afternoon, the crowd outside my shop had doubled. Someone had posted about the new bakery on social media, calling it the most authentic desserts in town. A local food blogger showed up with a camera, snapping pictures and asking about the story behind my name. "Whisper and Whisk," I told her, "represents honesty and rebirth, 2 things you can't fake." She smiled knowingly, jotting it down as if she understood exactly what I meant. Across the street, Melinda's windows looked strangely empty. I could see her pacing behind the counter, forcing cheerfulness for the few customers who remained. When she finally stepped outside again, she leaned against her doorway, arms crossed, watching the crowd pour into my shop. For the first time since her betrayal, I didn't feel anger. I felt calm. I had built this with my own hands, without lies, without stealing. She had built hers on deceit, and now it was crumbling before her eyes. Evening fell slowly, golden light bathing the shop in warmth. The air smelled like sugar and satisfaction. I watched as the last few customers lingered at their tables, chatting softly, reluctant to leave. Gretchen was counting the day's earnings at the counter, her eyes wide. "Nora," she said quietly, "this is more than we made in 2 weeks at the old place." I nodded, unable to hide the small smile forming on my lips. "It's not about the money," I whispered. "It's about the truth." Still, as I looked around at the glowing lights, the full display cases, and the happy faces, I couldn't deny the feeling blooming in my chest, hope, sweet and unexpected. When we finally closed for the night, The street outside had gone quiet. The glow from Crumble & Co. was dimmer now, a weak reflection of its former bustle. I stood by the window, looking out at the sign that once made my stomach twist. It didn't anymore. I wasn't afraid of it. I'd taken my power back, and she knew it. Gretchen locked the door, humming softly as she wiped down the counters. We were both too tired to talk much, but there was a peacefulness between us, the kind that comes after a storm. I was about to turn off the lights when Gretchen called out from near the door. "Nora," she said softly, "there's something here." I turned to see her holding a plain white envelope that had been slipped under the door. There was no name, no address, just my bakery's name written in uneven handwriting across the front. My heart gave a small, uneasy flutter. "Probably a thank you note," I said, trying to sound casual, though something about it felt off. Gretchen handed it to me, and I tore the edge carefully. Inside was a single piece of paper. The message was short, typed, and cold. "You won't win this time." For a long moment, neither of us said a word. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, and the air seemed to thicken around us. Gretchen's face paled. "Do you think it's her?" she whispered. I stared at the words, my pulse quickening. I didn't have to think. Of course it was. I folded the paper slowly, my mind steady despite the chill crawling down my spine. "Let her play her games," I said finally, sliding the note into my apron pocket. "I've already won more than she'll ever understand." As I turned off the lights and stepped outside, the night air felt cool and alive. The scent of baked sugar still lingered in the air, drifting between the two bakeries. I looked toward Melinda's darkened windows, imagining her pacing inside, stewing in her jealousy. A quiet smile touched my lips. She could send all the threats she wanted, the truth had already started working its magic, and I wasn't about to stop now. The first week after our grand opening felt like a dream I didn't want to wake from. Customers poured in daily, the air rich, with the scent of sugar and satisfaction. For the first time in years, I was thriving again, not just financially, but emotionally. The laughter that had once filled the Golden Whisk now echoed through Whisper and Whisk, and it felt like life itself had decided to give me a second chance. But good fortune, I've learned, has a way of stirring envy in those who can't bear to see someone rise after they've tried to bury them. It didn't take long before Melinda began showing signs of her unraveling. At first, it was subtle. A cold glance from her when our paths crossed on the sidewalk. A customer or two mentioning she'd made snide remarks about me trying too hard. But within a week, the bitterness began to spread beyond whispers. One morning, Gretchen burst into the back room, holding her phone, her brow furrowed. "Nora, you need to see this," she said, showing me a string of online reviews. Someone had posted that my pastries made them sick, another claimed. They'd found hair in the frosting. The accounts were new, faceless, but the pattern was too deliberate to ignore. Within hours, more followed complaints about unclean kitchens, expired ingredients, overpriced, overrated desserts. It was so clearly an attack that it almost made me laugh, though my chest burned with anger. I didn't need proof to know who was behind it. Melinda had started her war of desperation. Instead of responding defensively, I took a deep breath and decided on a different tactic. I posted a simple message on my bakery's social page. At Whisper and Whisk, every treat is made with honesty, heart, and hands that care. You're always welcome to see for yourself, our kitchen's open for a reason. The post wasn't defensive. It was confident, calm, and true. Within hours, customers flooded the comments section with pictures of their pastries, writing things like, "always perfect," and "you can taste the integrity." The fake reviews were buried under an avalanche of love. I smiled quietly to myself. I didn't need to fight fire with fire. Truth was enough. But Melinda wasn't finished. A few days later, I noticed her shop promoting limited-time specials. Her flyers, almost identical to mine, appeared around town. The names of her new desserts sounded eerily familiar too: Honey Delight Tart and Graceful Crumble. It was almost comical. She wasn't even trying to hide her imitation anymore. Even her logo had changed, the same soft cream tones, the same copper lettering that mirrored mine. She thought that by mimicking me again, she could confuse customers into returning to her. But what Melinda didn't realize was that imitation doesn't carry the same warmth as authenticity. You can copy presentation, but you can't counterfeit passion. Within days, the differences became obvious to everyone. Her pies taste flat now, one reviewer wrote online, like someone trying too hard to fake sweetness. Another said, something's missing from Crumble & Co. You can't replicate honesty. Reading those words brought a quiet satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about seeing truth prevail on its own terms. Rachel had been visiting that week, and she watched everything unfold with a fire in her eyes that reminded me of myself years ago. Mom, she said one evening while filming a short video for social media, people need to hear this. Not just what she did, but what you overcame. I was hesitant at first. I'd always been a private person. But she was right. The world loved a comeback. And I wanted my bakery to be more than a business. I wanted it to be proof that integrity could survive deceit. So Rachel started posting small clips online, me kneading dough in the open kitchen, greeting customers by name, telling small bits of my story. She titled the series, The Baker Who Rose Again. To my surprise, the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from strangers across the country, some saying they'd been betrayed by friends, others saying they were inspired to start over in their own lives. Orders began arriving faster than we could fill them. We even started shipping small batches of cookies and tarts nationwide. Every box carried a handwritten thank you note from me, signed simply, "With gratitude, Nora." The bakery that had once been a symbol of loss was now becoming a symbol of resilience. Meanwhile, Melinda's desperation grew more visible. Her once bustling cafe began showing empty tables. I saw her pacing behind her counter, the forced smile fading more each day. Her advertisements grew bolder, almost pleading, special discounts, buy one get one free. She even stood outside her shop one afternoon, handing out free samples. But no matter how hard she tried, the charm she'd once borrowed from me had worn off. People could see through her. Now, authenticity has a scent of its own, and hers had gone stale. Still, I knew better than to underestimate her. When people like Melinda begin to lose control, they don't accept defeat gracefully, they claw and scratch for relevance. I began to notice odd things around the bakery. A man loitering across the street longer than usual. A woman I didn't recognize asking strange questions about my ingredient suppliers. I brushed it off as paranoia at first, until something far stranger happened. It was a quiet Thursday evening. The shop had just closed, and Gretchen was cleaning the kitchen while I organized tomorrow's prep list. The warm hum of the ovens filled the room, and the soft glow from the lamps made the space feel peaceful. Suddenly, I heard Gretchen call out from the pantry, her voice sharp. "Nora, come here a second." I hurried over, wiping my hands on my apron, expecting maybe a spilled bag of flour or a misplaced order. But when I saw her face pale, tense, my stomach dropped. She pointed toward the back shelf, her voice low. "Look at that." Behind a bag of flour, nestled discreetly near the wall, was something small and metallic, a tiny black device with a faint blinking light. For a moment, I just stared at it, trying to process what I was seeing. Gretchen reached out, but I stopped her. "Don't touch it," I whispered. The air in the room felt suddenly heavy, the sound of the ovens too loud in my ears. It was a camera, a hidden one. Someone had planted it there, facing directly toward my main prep area, the heart of my kitchen. A chill ran through me, slow and deliberate, as realization sank in. This wasn't paranoia. This was sabotage. Someone wanted to watch me, to steal again what wasn't theirs, and I didn't need to ask who. The smell of desperation wasn't just metaphorical anymore. It was real, thick in the air, laced with deceit and fear. Melinda wasn't just losing, she was spiraling. Gretchen's voice trembled. "Do you think it's her?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at that small blinking light, the reflection flickering in my eyes. Then I exhaled slowly, the determination in me solidifying like caramel cooling on a tray. "It has to be," I said quietly. But this time, she picked the wrong kitchen to spy on. I turned off the lights, locking eyes with the faint glow of the device before we left. She wanted to play dirty. Fine, I could play smarter. The night Gretchen and I found that hidden camera, I barely slept. My mind replayed the sight of that tiny blinking light over and over, as if it were burned into my memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see it, a small, silent witness planted in my kitchen, watching, recording, stealing. It wasn't just the violation that haunted me, it was the intent behind it. Melinda hadn't learned her lesson. She wasn't content with taking what was mine once. She was determined to do it again. But, this time, she'd made a mistake because I wasn't the same woman she'd betrayed years ago. I wasn't fragile anymore. I wasn't naive. I was prepared to fight back not with anger or deceit, but with truth. The following morning, I carefully placed the camera into a small box and drove to a local tech shop run by a young man named Eric. He looked no older than 30, with an easy smile and hands that seemed to know their way around electronics. When I handed him the device, I felt a strange mixture of dread and calm. "I need to know where this came from," I told him. "And I need to know exactly who's been watching me." He promised to take a look while I waited. I sat in the corner of the shop, my hands gripping a cup of stale coffee, every second stretching into an eternity. After about an hour, he returned, his expression serious now. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said carefully, "this device was transmitting footage live to a local IP address." I swallowed, hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Do you know where?" He hesitated before saying it. "It's registered to Crumble & Co. Bakery." For a moment, everything went still. I felt the world around me narrow to a single sharp point. Even though I'd suspected it, hearing the confirmation made my stomach twist. Melinda had crossed another line. She wasn't just trying to steal my ideas anymore. She was trying to infiltrate my life, my space, my sanctuary. The betrayal that once broke me now ignited something cold and calculated inside. I thanked Eric, took the device, and sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. It was time to end this. When I told Gretchen, she was furious. "We should call the police," she insisted. But I wasn't ready for that, not yet. I wanted to be smart, not impulsive. So I reached out to a lawyer, a calm, meticulous woman named Dana, who listened patiently as I explained everything from the stolen recipes years ago to the camera in my kitchen. After reviewing what I had, she advised me to gather more evidence before making any legal move. "If she's desperate enough to do this once," Dana said, "she'll do it again. And when she does, you'll be ready." Her voice was steady, reassuring, but my heart still raced. Following her advice, Gretchen and I quietly installed our own security cameras, small, discreet, hidden in corners. Melinda's people would never notice. If they came again, I'd have undeniable proof. And it didn't take long for the trap to work. 3 nights later, long after we'd closed, I received a notification from the new camera system on my phone. My heart skipped a beat. Motion detected in the kitchen. I opened the feed and froze. There she was, Melinda's assistant, the same woman who worked behind her counter every day, moving through my bakery with a flashlight. She wasn't stealing money or damaging anything. She was photographing my prep station, my recipe notes, and even the ingredients I'd left on the counters. Every click of her camera felt like another nail in Melinda's coffin. I called Gretchen, and we watched silently from our homes as the footage streamed live, our anger simmering into quiet resolve. The next morning, I saved every second of the footage onto a flash drive. When I showed it to Dana, she smiled for the first time. "This," she said, tapping the screen, "is what justice looks like." I felt my chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with something fierce and freeing. For years, Melinda had hidden behind charm and deceit. She'd played the victim, the innovator, the darling of the town. But now, the truth was finally on my side, and I intended to show it to everyone. For days, I thought about what to do next. I could have gone straight to the police, filed charges, or even sued. But a part of me knew that Melinda's punishment wouldn't come from courts or fines. It would come from exposure from the very people whose admiration she'd stolen. So, one quiet evening, I set up my phone on the bakery counter and began to record. I titled the video "The Real Story Behind Crumble & Co." It wasn't dramatic or loud. I didn't raise my voice or hurl accusations. I simply spoke the truth. I told the story of my friendship with Melinda, how she'd stolen my recipes, my business, and even tried to ruin me again. Then, I played the footage, the camera we'd found, the proof of her assistant sneaking in, the side-by-side comparison of my original recipe cards and her copied desserts. Finally, I ended the video by saying, "You can steal someone's ideas, but you can't steal their integrity. And in baking, as in life, the truth always rises." When I uploaded it, I expected a handful of views, maybe a few supportive comments from locals. But within hours, it exploded. People shared it on social media, tagging it with phrases like, "Number Baker Justice" and "Number Sweet Truth." The video spread like wildfire, thousands of views turning into hundreds of thousands overnight. Strangers from across the country commented, expressing outrage, support, and admiration. Customers began posting their own stories about betrayal, linking it to mine. Even food bloggers picked it up, analyzing the footage and calling it a masterclass in grace and truth-telling. By the next morning, my bakery phone wouldn't stop ringing. Orders had doubled again. Reporters wanted interviews. Customers lined up outside before dawn. And for the first time, Melinda's name wasn't being whispered with admiration. It was being dragged through the mud she'd created for herself. When I walked past Crumble & Co. that morning, the air felt different. The once crowded shop was eerily empty. The cheerful chalkboard outside had been erased. And through the window, I saw Melinda sitting alone at one of her own tables, her phone pressed to her ear, her face pale and drawn. For a fleeting second, I almost felt pity. Almost. But then I remembered the years she'd taken from me, the humiliation, the nights I'd spent doubting my worth. No, this wasn't cruelty. This was balance. As Gretchen and I prepared for another busy day, the bell over the door chimed again, but this time, it wasn't a customer. A young reporter stood there, notebook in hand, smiling brightly. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "I'm from the New Hampshire Gazette. We'd love to feature you in tomorrow's issue, the woman who exposed the biggest baking scandal our town has ever seen." For a moment, I just stood there, stunned. Then, slowly, I smiled. "I think the truth finally did what it was meant to do," I said quietly. She nodded, scribbling notes as I wiped my hands on my apron, the scent of fresh tarts filling the air. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, soft and silent, the world cleansing itself, just as my life finally was. The morning the newspaper hit the stands, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing non-stop on the kitchen counter. For a second, I thought something was wrong. But when I picked it up and saw the dozens of messages, the calls, and the flood of notifications, I knew something extraordinary had happened. There, splashed across the front page of the New Hampshire Gazette, was the headline in bold letters: "Local baker exposes recipe theft scandal Crumble & Co." Crumbles under truth. The picture beneath it showed me standing proudly behind the counter of Whisper and Whisk, holding a pie with a small, honest smile. I hadn't realized until that moment how much weight I'd been carrying, and how good it felt to finally see the truth printed for all to read. By the time I arrived at the bakery that morning, a small crowd was already gathered outside. Some people held flowers, others brought cards or handwritten notes. A few of them had been my loyal customers from the Golden Whisk, people who had drifted away after Melinda opened her cafe. They looked at me with sheepish smiles, guilt shimmering in their eyes. "We're sorry, Nora," one woman said softly. "We should have known it was your recipe all along." I smiled and waved off their apologies, my voice calm but firm. "What matters," I told them, "is that you're here now." And I meant it. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about absolving someone else, it was about freeing yourself. Inside, the air smelled of caramel, cinnamon, and coffee, that comforting blend that had become the signature of Whisper and Whisk. Gretchen had already started the ovens, and Rachel, who'd come to visit for the weekend, was filming the growing line from behind the counter. "You're trending again," she said with a laugh. "Half the town's posting pictures of your pies." I shook my head, smiling despite myself. "It's strange," I murmured, "how something so small, a recipe, a friendship, can cause such chaos." Rachel looked at me knowingly. "It wasn't small, Mom," she said. "You turned pain into purpose. That's what people see." Across the street, Crumble & Co. sat eerily still. The cheerful music that once poured from its open doors was gone. The chalkboard that used to boast specials now hung blank, its edges curling from weather and neglect. For days, Melinda had tried to fight back, releasing statements claiming that the video was taken out of context, that the footage had been fabricated. But her words were hollow. The evidence was undeniable, and the public was unforgiving. Customers demanded refunds, suppliers canceled contracts, not wanting their names tied to the scandal. Her landlord, the same one who had once handed me my eviction notice, raised her rent, citing damage to the building's reputation. Karma, it seemed, had a sense of humor. Within a week, the empire she'd built on lies began to crumble in the most poetic way. Her once bustling cafe stood empty, the smell of burnt sugar lingering like regret. I sometimes caught glimpses of her through the glass, standing alone behind her counter, staring at a room of empty chairs, her hands folded tightly as if she could hold everything together by sheer will. There was no laughter, no camera flashes, no loyal customers anymore, just silence. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of pity for her after all. We had shared so many years of friendship before it all fell apart. But then, I remembered the nights I'd spent staring at my closed bakery, the humiliation she'd caused me, the way she had smiled while stealing my life's work. Pity turned to clarity. She wasn't a victim of bad luck, she was a victim of her own choices. Meanwhile, Whisper and Whisk flourished like never before. Orders poured in faster than we could bake them. Our story, my story, had struck a chord with people beyond our little town. Customers drove in from nearby cities, just to taste the desserts, made by the woman who stood her ground. I hired 2 new bakers, a college student to help with social media, and another full-time assistant for Gretchen. The shelves were always stocked, the coffee always fresh, and the air always filled with warmth and laughter. There were days I had to step outside just to breathe in the joy of it all, the sounds of happiness spilling out onto the street. And yet, even amid all the triumph, I never lost sight of humility. I didn't gloat. I didn't rub my success in Melinda's face. The truth had already done that for me. Sometimes, justice doesn't need grand gestures, it just needs time to simmer until it's served warm and unmistakably deserved. I would catch people whispering as they passed her empty cafe, their tones hushed but certain. "She got what she deserved," they would say. And I'd keep walking, pretending not to hear, but deep down, I knew they were right. As the weeks passed, Crumble & Co. grew quieter until one day, its windows went dark. The open sign was gone, replaced by a small notice taped to the glass that read, "Closed for renovations." But everyone knew it wasn't renovations. Melinda had shut down. By the end of the month, a moving truck appeared early one morning. I watched from across the street as boxes and crates were loaded into the back. Melinda stood near the door, directing the movers with a stiff expression, her once perfect posture slumped ever so slightly. She looked smaller somehow, diminished not just by failure, but by the weight of her own deceit. I didn't wave. I didn't step outside. I simply stood by the window, wiping down the counter, watching as she drove away without looking back. That evening, the bakery was packed. The golden light from the windows spilled across the street, and laughter filled the air again. I lifted my gaze toward the empty storefront that once bore her name. The space looked abandoned but peaceful, as though the storm had finally passed. Gretchen handed me a cup of tea and said quietly, "She's gone, Nora." I nodded, feeling a strange calm wash over me. "Yes," I replied. "And now, so is the bitterness." Life fell into a beautiful rhythm after that. Each day brought new faces, new stories, new moments of gratitude. Rachel's online videos kept attracting visitors, and people often told me they came not just for the pastries, but for the feeling inside the shop, the honesty, the warmth, the redemption they could taste in every bite. It made me realize that what I'd built was far greater than a bakery. It was a symbol proof that integrity might bend under betrayal, but it never breaks. One morning, about a month after Melinda's departure, I arrived early to prep for the day. The town was still asleep, and the first rays of sunlight spilled across the quiet street. As I reached for the shop's door handle, I noticed a small brown package on the doorstep. There was no return address, no note, just my name written in familiar handwriting. My pulse quickened. I brought it inside, placed it gently on the counter, and slowly unwrapped the twine holding it shut. Inside, nestled between layers of brown paper, was something that made my breath catch: my grandmother's original recipe card, the same one Melinda had stolen years ago. The edges were worn, a small smudge of butterscotch stained the corner, but it was unmistakably hers and mine. I sank into a chair, the card trembling in my hands. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stared at it, tears blurring my vision. I didn't know if Melinda had sent it as an apology or as closure for herself, but it didn't matter. Holding that recipe again felt like the final piece of my soul had come home. I looked around the bakery, the soft lights, the quiet hum of the ovens, the framed photo of my grandmother hanging on the wall, and smiled. The world had a way of balancing itself, of making sure truth found its way back to those who honored it. The scent of freshly baked tarts filled the air as I whispered softly to the empty room. "Welcome home." The morning sunlight filtered through the front windows of Whisper and Whisk, casting soft, golden lines across the counter. The world outside was just waking up, the quiet hum of traffic, the faint rustle of leaves, the sound of a new day beginning. I stood in my bakery, holding the worn recipe card in my hands, my fingers trembling slightly as I traced the edges. The paper was fragile, yellowed with age, but it carried a strength that time couldn't touch. The handwriting, my grandmother's elegant cursive, looked almost alive, each letter a quiet whisper from the past. I could almost hear her voice again, gentle and wise, telling me, "Nora, good things rise slowly, but they rise all the same." For a moment, I just stood there, letting tears prick my eyes. The card had traveled a long, painful road to find its way back to me, much like I had traveled my own. It wasn't just a recipe anymore. It was a symbol of everything I'd lost and everything I'd rebuilt. I thought of all the nights I'd spent crying over betrayal, of the fear, the anger, the exhaustion. Yet now, holding that small piece of paper, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. I took a deep breath and decided it didn't belong tucked away in a drawer anymore. It deserved to be seen, not as a trophy of revenge, but as a testament to resilience. I found a glass frame from the storage room and placed the recipe card inside it, smoothing the creases carefully. Then I hung it on the wall above the counter, where sunlight would catch it every morning. The ink glistened faintly under the light, and it felt right, like the story had come full circle. Customers would look at it sometimes and ask about it, and I'd tell them it was a family recipe, a reminder that what's made with love always lasts longer than what's taken with greed. As the day went on, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. People often asked if I regretted what I did, if exposing Melinda, confronting her lies, was worth all the chaos that followed. I always paused before answering, because it wasn't a simple yes or no. What I did hadn't been about revenge, not truly. It was about reclaiming my name, my story, and my sense of self-worth. It was about proving that truth, no matter how long it takes, will always find its way back into the light. Revenge is fleeting, but justice, quiet, patient, and honest, endures. Melinda's cafe was gone now, the building still empty months after she left town. Sometimes I'd pass by and catch my reflection in the darkened windows, and instead of anger, I felt gratitude. She had been the storm that broke me, yes, but also the storm that forced me to rebuild stronger. Without her betrayal, Whisper and Whisk would never have been born. Without her lies, I might never have learned the power of my own truth. There's a strange kind of beauty in realizing that the worst thing someone ever did to you can also lead to the best version of who you become. In the months that followed, my bakery continued to flourish. The once small-town shop had become a place where people came not just for pastries, but for inspiration. Customers shared their own stories with me, of losses, of second chances, of courage. They said my journey reminded them that it's never too late to start again. Those conversations warmed me in a way that no amount of success ever could. And so, I decided to pay it forward. Every Thursday afternoon after closing hours, I started hosting free baking workshops for young bakers, mostly college students and single parents trying to make ends meet. I taught them not just how to bake, but how to protect their creations and their hearts. Your recipes, I would say, are pieces of your soul. Don't hand them to people who don't respect the story behind them. Watching their eyes light up when their first batch came out golden and perfect reminded me of my younger self, eager, hopeful, and terrified all at once. One of those evenings, as I was packing up after class, Rachel came to visit. She stood by the counter, watching me with that same look she used to have when she was a little girl, the one that said she still saw magic in what I did. "Mom," she said softly, glancing up at the framed recipe card above the counter. "Grandma would be so proud of you." Her voice cracked just slightly, and I felt my throat tighten. I reached over and squeezed her hand, smiling through the emotion. "Maybe," I said, "but I think she'd just ask for another slice of pie." We both laughed, the sound easy and genuine, echoing through the bakery like music. There was no bitterness left in that laughter, no resentment, only warmth. We sat together for a while, sharing a cup of tea as the last of the daylight faded. The bakery around us glowed softly, the scent of sugar and vanilla lingering in the air. I realized then that peace doesn't arrive all at once. It sneaks in quietly, in the simple moments you no longer take for granted. Sometimes, when I close the bakery late at night, I take one last look around before turning off the lights. The counters gleam, the ovens hum softly as they cool, and the framed recipe catches a faint glimmer from the streetlight outside. I think of the people who walk past my window, strangers, friends, former customers, and I hope they see more than just a bakery. I hope they see a story of perseverance, of what it means to keep your integrity intact even when the world tries to steal it from you. I've come to understand that what happened wasn't just about stolen recipes or ruined friendships. It was about identity, about standing tall in the face of betrayal and refusing to let someone else define your worth. In the end, I didn't just win back my livelihood, I won back myself. The seasons have changed since that first day I reopened next to Melinda's cafe. Winter melted into spring, and the streets outside the bakery are alive again with laughter and light. Children press their faces against the glass, pointing at the rows of tarts and pies. Couples linger over coffee, sharing smiles. There's a rhythm to it all now, a peace that feels earned. Every once in a while, I'll still make that old butterscotch apple crumble pie, the one my grandmother passed down. But now, it tastes different, not because I changed the recipe, but because I changed. As I wipe down the counter and prepare to lock up for the night, I look at the framed recipe one last time. The ink glows faintly under the warm light, and I feel a quiet smile form on my lips. For years, I thought that recipe was the key to my success. But now I understand it was never just about the ingredients. It was about the love, the patience, and the courage it took to protect what truly mattered. In the end, my recipe didn't just feed people, it fed my soul.